Great. Well, again, good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the KnowTheChain ICT Benchmark Findings 2025. During the course of this webinar, we will be highlighting the major thematic and reporting trends captured from the 45 largest ICT companies to provide you with insight into the evolution of policy and practice in addressing forced labour across the sector's supply chains. My name is Anya Clark, and I'm head of KnowTheChain and investor strategy for the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, senior researcher Rosie Monaghan and assistant researcher Kane Shaw, and a panel of subject matter experts and practitioners to dig deeper into the findings today. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to run through some key details for today's session. The session will run for about 75 minutes. We'll begin with a presentation on the benchmark analysis, providing insights into the latest findings. In the second part, we'll be joined by 4 expert panelists who will reflect on their results, discuss the current state of the sector, and share their thoughts and recommendations on the path forward. To wrap up, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. So a few points of housekeeping. So please do keep yourselves on mute for the session. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or pop a question in the Q&A box. Kane will be moderating the Q&A, ensuring we get to as many questions as possible. Now, the session is being recorded for those who couldn't join live. And so to our speakers, and we're delighted to be joined by 4 allies and subject matter experts from across the field of business and human rights, industry, and investment. Charles Neese serves as Programme Coordinator for the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers Migrant Workers Programmes. Since 2019, he has been based in Taichung, Taiwan, where he has spearheaded Maryknoll's apostolic project on supply chain due diligence. Through his work, Charles amplifies migrant worker voices and escalates their experiences by facilitating direct engagements between workers facing forced labour indicators and multinational brands. This critical connection not only provides migrant workers with greater access to remedy, but also equips relevant stakeholders with a deeper understanding of their realities straight from the workers themselves. Michael Ryan Mercene arrived in Taiwan in 2008 from the Philippines, beginning his journey as a machinery manufacturing factory worker. After 10 years in the industry, he made a remarkable transition to higher education, becoming an undergraduate student at Providence University in Taichung. Over the course of his 15 years in Taiwan, Michael has been a dedicated volunteer with the Ugnayan ministry, migrant ministry, actively supporting fellow migrants in raising workplace concerns with both the Philippine and Taiwanese governments. His advocacy has played a vital role in empowering migrant workers and amplifying their voices in key labour discussions. Luda Svystunova is a senior analyst and head of social research at Amundi's ESG research and engagement team, where she also covers technology, software and hardware sectors. She was previously acting responsible investment lead at Ardevora Asset Management. Prior to working in stewardship, she worked in academia and consulting and holds a PhD in management from the University of Bath. And Monique Gerson serves as the Global Human Rights Senior Manager at Samsung, where she provides technical guidance to internal core teams on effective human rights due diligence. Her work spans policy development, process improvements, internal capacity building, and strategic engagement with external organizations. Prior to joining Samsung, Monique built expertise in business and human rights, working across NGOs, business associations, and consulting. Her multifaceted experience enables her to navigate complex human rights challenges with corporate environments while driving meaningful impact. And thank you all again for being with us today. So before we dig into the core findings, I'd like to briefly introduce KnowTheChain for those who might be less familiar with our work. So KnowTheChain is a program of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre dedicated to providing companies and investors with the tools to better understand and address forced labour and labour rights risks in their supply chains. By leveraging benchmarking, we aim to harness the competitive market dynamics and reputational pressures, encouraging businesses to elevate their human rights practice. Since 2016, we've been benchmarking companies across 3 high-risk sectors: ICT, food and beverage, and apparel and footwear. Our company selection is based on market capitalization and the percentage of revenue derived from own branded products, with regional diversification ensuring that we capture the largest global players within each sector. Additionally, we strive to include sub-industries within supply chain. So for ICT, this spans semiconductor companies, electronic component manufacturers, and consumer-facing brands. Our benchmarking methodology continues to evolve in response to legislative developments on human rights due diligence and the growing expectations of stakeholders. And we engage companies, investors, civil society, labour unions, and subject matter experts to refine our approach and ensure our benchmarks remain impactful. This latest benchmark marks a pivotal moment in our strategy as we shift our focus towards amplifying workers' lived experience to provide a more comprehensive assessment of corporate policies in practice. As part of the 2025 ICT benchmark, and for the first time, KnowTheChain has conducted in-depth interviews with 29 migrant workers across 16 facilities in Taiwan's electronics sector, examining their recruitment experience, working conditions, and ability to raise grievances. Through this lens, we aim to highlight real-world insights, ensuring corporate responses to forced labour are not just policies on paper, but meaningful protections that drive tangible change. So over the past year, the global landscape has been shaped by significant economic challenges, widening inequality, persistent conflict, and a worsening climate crisis. These factors have collectively intensified the risk of forced labour in global supply chains, exacerbating already fragile working conditions existent due to informalization, weak labour protections, and corporate purchasing practices for millions of workers worldwide. The convergence of climate and geopolitical crises has led to increased displacement, with migration levels reaching their highest point in the past 5 decades. Despite their critical role in sustaining various industries from ICT to apparel and agri-food, migrant workers are often overlooked in supply chains. Data from the ILO reveals that migrant workers are 3 times more likely to experience forced labour than their non-migrant counterparts. Companies, through their commercial practices, may inadvertently or directly contribute to these heightened risks. At the same time, corporate accountability is undergoing a seismic shift. In response to these deteriorating labour conditions and the emergence of new human rights due diligence legislations, companies are facing growing expectations to act. Against a backdrop of impending regulatory frameworks, including the European Union's mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence law, enhanced corporate sustainability requirements, and a forced labour ban, alongside existing US forced labour regulations, the consequences of failing to eliminate forced labour from supply chains are becoming increasingly severe. And so to the ICT sector, which forms the basis of growth and development in the global economy. Vital components of all electronic systems, from smartphones to electric vehicles, are at the forefront of renewable energy technologies key to an energy transition. As such, the potential of the sector to contribute to global prosperity is significant. However, these business models also rely on supply chains built on conflict minerals and the labour of millions of workers at heightened risk of exploitation and forced labour, meaning more is required for them to realise positive outcomes. And for a closer look at ICT supply chains and their exposure to forced labour risks, I will hand over to Rosie Monaghan, Senior Researcher at KnowTheChain, to tell us more.
Thanks, Anya, and thank you so much to you all for taking the time to join us today. Before we go into the findings, I'm just going to outline some of the factors or conditions within electronic supply chains that tend to drive some of the forced labor risks we see. Electronic supply chains tend to use just-in-time production, meaning that lead times can be short and that companies might need a flexible workforce that can work fluctuating hours. And this tends to lead to a reliance on temporary or contract labor, and often these are migrant workers. Relying on temporary labor tends to create additional barriers to unionization, and as such, exacerbates forced labor risks. Modular production is another feature of electronic supply chains, meaning that assembly operations are separate from technology development, and high volume components can be easily substituted. This has led to a lot of offshoring and outsourcing to contract manufacturers. A lot of that manufacturing and assembling takes place in low-cost production sites, which often have weaker labor protections. These risks are particularly prevalent for women and migrant workers. Women make up 60% of workers in the electronics industry, and migrant workers typically rely on their employers for accommodation, food, legal status, and so are at higher risk of exploitation. As Anya mentioned, we've been gathering and analysing worker testimony, and we've focused on Taiwan as a high-risk context, but these risks are prevalent across supply chain locations. The US Department of Labor list of goods officially lists China and Malaysia as high risk in electronics, and companies in the benchmark also disclosed that they'd identified forced labor risks in other locations, including Hungary, India, Japan, Poland, Slovakia, and Thailand. And then moving on to the findings. So this is the benchmark ranking, which I appreciate might be a bit tricky to read all the company names on this screen, but what you should be able to see is the quite vast range of scores. The highest score with Samsung at 61 out of 100 and the lowest 0 out of 100 with BOE technology. The average score for the sector was 20, and we had only 3 companies scoring above 50 in the benchmark. So quite a significant gap between the average company in the sector and the top scoring companies. On some of our key findings, starting with findings by theme, the KnowTheChain methodology is comprised of 7 themes that you can see represented in this graph, broadly aligned with the UNGPs covering commitment, due diligence, and remedy. So as you can see, we saw the poorest scores of 5 out of 100 on the themes of purchasing practices and enabling workers' rights. And what this indicates is poor performance in terms of adopting responsible purchasing practices, including those relating to planning and forecasting or pricing that addresses the full cost of production. We also assess whether companies disclose quantitative data that demonstrates how those practices are working, but only 16% of companies disclose this data. So for example, payment terms. It also highlights the absence of support for the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. 93% of companies scored 0 on this indicator, and only 1 company, HPE, reported engaging with a union to resolve a worker grievance. The right to organise allows workers to better challenge abuse and exploitative conditions, so an absence of support for this right is a problem when it comes to addressing forced labour risks. The next lowest scoring theme was remedy at 7 out of 100. We identified forced labour allegations linked to the supply chains of 36 companies, with some linked to multiple allegations, but all scored 0 on how they'd responded to these allegations. In addition, outside of allegations, we assess whether companies disclose how labour rights violations more broadly have been remedied, but only 7% of companies disclose detail on more than one example of remedy outcomes for supply chain workers. We know from allegations, company disclosure, our Taiwan research, and recent investigations by other organisations such as Transparentum that picked up wide-scale fee charging to electronics workers, that it's not the case that abuse isn't occurring, and therefore we should be seeing remedy on a much bigger scale if companies are to evidence that due diligence processes are working effectively. And finally, we saw the strongest progress from companies on areas related to governance, so disclosure of board oversight of supply chain forced labour policies and programmes. That was newly disclosed by 7 companies. 6 companies disclosed how they conduct a human rights risk assessment for the first time. And we also saw, just as we did in 2022, an increase in the number of policies prohibiting worker-paid recruitment fees. But this wasn't matched by an increase in the disclosure of the due diligence steps designed to implement this policy or disclosure of outcomes for workers. So what we're seeing is a widening gap between the disclosure of policy versus the disclosure of practice. And so although the sector performed very poorly on purchasing practices, we did see some good practice like this from Cisco, which outlined how it was approaching identified risks associated with purchasing practices, including supply shortages, forecast accuracy, production goals, rush orders and lead times, and contractual terms. So the company mentioned specific steps taken to mitigate the identified impacts, including smoothing production spikes by building material stock and extra inventory to reduce the risk of material shortages. It also said it strengthened forecasting visibility by moving from less than 1 year's forecast visibility to 24-month rolling window across hardware products. And what makes this good practice and distinguishes it from some of the other disclosure we see is that these are concrete steps disclosed by a company of how practices have been adjusted or changed once an impact has been identified, whereas we might more typically see disclosure citing an awareness of the possibility of procurement practices impacting working conditions or forced labour risks, but without explaining what has been done about that as part of due diligence. Regionally, we saw the strongest improvements from Asian companies this year, and this was quite noticeable when compared with other regional findings. These came mostly from South Korea and Taiwan-based companies, including Samsung, Foxconn, SK Hynix, LG Electronics, and TSMC, which meant that we could see quite notable score increases from companies in each of the low, mid, and high scoring ranges. In Europe, despite new EU regulation upcoming, scores dropped on average by 5 points, which essentially means that those companies didn't demonstrate sufficient progress in line with stakeholder expectations since 2022. And US companies saw the largest score drops, falling by 7 points on average. So we might assume, looking at different factors affecting that context, that this may have to do with a lot of layoffs among US companies, as well as perhaps ESG backlash, but the reasons for these score drops probably vary greatly by company. To dig in a bit further into one of the key findings I mentioned earlier, we saw a notable increase in policies prohibiting worker-paid recruitment fees. That leaves the sector now with almost all companies disclosing such a policy at 96%. And this is significantly higher than what we see in other sectors that we assess, including food or apparel. But it is worth noting the distinction that while these policies prohibit workers being charged fees and say that workers should be repaid where they have been charged, only 3 companies' policies align more closely with the employer pays principle by specifying that employers should be covering those costs directly rather than repaying workers later. Only 13% of companies disclosed the steps they were taking to work towards ensuring that workers don't pay fees in the first instance, and rather that the employer is directly and proactively covering those costs. So this could include, for example, gaining an understanding of the costs charged in different recruitment corridors, mapping labour recruiters used by suppliers in sending and receiving countries, or verifying that employers are paying for the cost of recruitment by reviewing key documentation. So this gap between policy and practice also seems to reflect that companies are approaching the issue of recruitment fees by reimbursing workers where they are found to have paid fees, as opposed to having checks in place to ensure that employer pays is being enforced and implemented. And as policy requirements are violated and it is known that workers do continue to pay fees, it's really important that companies do have these due diligence processes in place to ensure repayment. And a third of companies did disclose concrete data or examples of remediation of fees to supply chain workers, which is again higher than what we tend to see in other sectors that we assess. However, if the burden of payment is to be shifted from the worker to the employer, this approach does need to be combined with implementation of employer pays. Relying on reimbursement processes can cause problems because this approach is likely to be piecemeal. Not all worker fee payments are likely to be detected via audits. Where they are, audits tend to require workers to have certain documentation as proof of payment, which they may not have. And in addition, fee payments might be discovered late, and workers may have already left their employer or their country of work, making it more difficult to ensure that they're remediated. So onto some good practices. On recruitment fee prevention, we saw a particularly good practice from Apple, which gave a strong indication of the scope of its due diligence efforts by disclosing data on the outcomes of these processes. So we can see how many audits were conducted in how many locations, how many labour agencies were mapped across how many countries. And another more unusual aspect of the processes that was mentioned here was the monitoring of job postings and social media channels for non-compliant hiring practices. The company also outlines promoting direct hiring by implementing internal referral bonuses and online recruitment options, making it easier for jobs to be obtained directly and not via labour recruiters. And on to some other good practice examples that we saw in relation to responsible recruitment. Both Apple and HPE specifically mentioned either risks to internal migrant workers, i.e. not only foreign migrant workers, or the inclusion of both internal and foreign migrant workers in the scope of their due diligence programs. So Apple disclosed that labour agencies in their supply chains are mapped regardless of whether they recruit domestically or recruit foreign contract workers. HPE identified and disclosed risks associated with internal migrant workers in India. And this tends to go beyond the approach typically disclosed by some companies that might focus only on risks to foreign migrant workers. In terms of remediation, Cisco disclosed an example of a fee investigation at a component supplier in Taiwan, which found workers had paid fees and had also paid fees at a previous employer that they'd transferred from. And it outlines the process for itemizing fees paid with both current and previous employers and fees charged along the recruitment journey, which resulted in the repayment amount due to workers doubling. On labour recruiter mapping, Samsung disclosed targeted due diligence for 21 suppliers in Malaysia, Hungary, and Slovakia, and identified 32 agencies in 10 countries. It specifies the number of agencies identified in sending countries and in which countries, and the same data for those identified in receiving countries, giving a good indication of the scope and the outcomes of this programme. The company also disclosed the number of suppliers and workers who took part in responsible recruitment training per year and in which supply chain locations. So as I mentioned earlier, we have conducted worker interviews with a view to understanding workers' experience in this sector and to test how policy commitments appear to be playing out in practice. We wanted to do this in a location which is highly relevant for benchmark companies in this sector, as well as where there are known risks for migrant workers. Taiwan produces the most semiconductors in the world and 90% of global production capacity of advanced chips, as well as significant production of other key parts like circuit boards. So while supply chain transparency over first and second tier suppliers in this sector is quite limited, we do know that this is a significant sourcing context for electronic supply chains. So that's on Taiwan's role in the sector. And then in relation to migrant workers, Taiwan has a super-aged population and as such relies heavily on a migrant workforce with 5 official migration corridors now set up. There are some known risks or practices that contribute to forced labour risks, and those include that 2 types of recruitment or employment fees are legal. Those are placement fees, otherwise known as recruitment fees, and service fees, which are ongoing employment costs, typically deducted from workers' pay or bank accounts. So we worked with a local partner to conduct 29 migrant worker interviews. All these migrant workers were Filipino, and Filipino migrant workers represent the majority of migrant workers in the electronics sector. They were based across 16 electronics facilities, who we found were supplying to essentially half of our benchmark companies. Their experience was quite wide-ranging. Some had worked at the facilities for as long as 13 years. Others were quite newly recruited and had worked there for 2 months. Workers were asked about the payment of fees, whether their contracts and actual working conditions lined up, and if they'd taken out loans to cover the costs of recruitment where relevant, and whether they'd been repaid. We also asked about other working conditions like overtime, living standards, and whether they felt able to report grievances. And if we move to the next slide. A number of indicators of forced labour came up in workers' responses. What we also found was that their testimony highlighted some gaps in company policy implementation, but also a likely inconsistency in how policies were being implemented from buyer to buyer. So I'll go into this a bit more, but first of all, to go into the data in this graph, 59% of interviewed workers said they paid placement fees as part of their recruitment. The amounts they reported paying often exceeded the legal amount, which was the cost of 1 month's salary. Only 5 of the 17 workers said that the company had asked them if they paid fees, and 3 workers who reported paying placement fees said that they got a refund. We also found that 31% of the workers said they paid service fees, which were deducted directly from their bank accounts. We found this number quite surprisingly low, given the service fees are legal, but this seemed to suggest that some buyers are enforcing their employer pays policies and ensuring that workers aren't having to pay for these costs. Workers also reported some cases of contract deception, reported inconsistencies related to contractual commitments that workers' accommodation and or meals would be free, only for workers to find that they had to pay for their dormitories or were given fewer meals per day than promised. And lastly, dormitory curfews, indicating that some restrictions were being placed on migrant workers' freedom of movement, were reported by 28% of workers. And workers noted that curfews were applied not only on working days, but also on workers' days off, as well as weekends. So as I mentioned, it became clear through this process that some companies do appear to be enforcing their policy requirements with suppliers and ensuring that employers cover recruitment costs. So even though those service fees are legal, some workers weren't paying them, and this is something that we couldn't detect from company disclosure alone because of the lack of disclosure on how policies were being implemented. In addition, workers in different departments within one supplier facility gave different answers as to whether or not they'd paid monthly service fees, suggesting that in one department or production line, the employer covers the fee costs, whereas in another department they don't. And this suggests that workers will pay fees or not, depending on which buyer is sourcing from which department, highlighting an inconsistency in how this is being implemented. And finally, all interviewed workers who joined a facility within the last 15 months, which was 4 workers at 2 facilities, said they paid neither placement fees or service fees, and that might suggest a ramping up of the focus on implementing employer pays policies. So what we take from this is that while some companies do appear to be taking additional due diligence steps to ensure the enforcement of their policy requirements, others aren't and are lagging behind in limiting forced labour risks in their supply chains. And if we move to the next slide. So on some of the other issues highlighted by workers, we wanted to get some understanding of access to remedy and ability to organise. So in terms of access to unions or other forms of worker representation, only 1 worker reported that there was a union at their factory. 4 other workers indicated that there were other representation structures in place, but because it can be more difficult for migrant workers to join a union, workers were also asked whether they felt able to join a union or a committee. And as you can see on the slide here, 1 worker responded, "It's difficult to say because we don't know what will happen and if it will affect our work and employment." Workers were also asked whether they knew how to report a grievance and if they knew anyone who had reported a grievance. So around 2/3 of workers said yes, they did know somebody who had reported a grievance. And among those who didn't, 3 said the reason for this was based on the fear of repercussions, and 1 mentioned that everyone is afraid to file a complaint because it might be the reason that they're not rehired and will affect their work. So that brings me to the end of KTC's research findings, and I'll hand back to Anya.
Thank you, Rosie, for that detailed overview. I've just left on the screen some very high-level recommendations that we make in the report relating to some key aspects of our analysis. But we advise everybody to read the report and identify yourselves recommendations, particularly as they relate to the Taiwan context, because we do a deep dive on that context as well and make some bespoke recommendations. I want to turn over now to the panel to get their perspectives and reflections on the findings. And I will turn to Michael first, and just to say that Michael and Charles were instrumental partners in conducting the worker deep dive, the worker interviews in Taiwan, and helping develop the analysis for the report. So I'm particularly interested to hear from both of them about their reflections on the findings. But Michael, let's start with you. Did anything jump out at you in particular from the Taiwanese context and from your perspective working with Filipino migrant workers on the ground? I think you're muted, Michael.
Hello?
Yes, perfect. We can hear you now.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Anne, for the introductions. Thank you for giving me a chance to speak in this panel. So, as a workers representative, so these situations of migrant workers in Taiwan involves several challenges. So, including the double contracts, difficulties in joining unions, so due to threats of retaliations and other issue in a monthly broker's fees and restrictions of freedoms of movement. In a double contract, migrant workers often face an issue of a double contract in a country of origin to the country of destinations. There are two existing contracts. One contract is from the home country, which is allowed and signed by our Philippine government or home country government. And the other contract is in country of destinations. It is also signed by the Philippine de facto representative office here in Taiwan. So which is valid? So in migrant worker situations, the second contract is always the one exists here in Taiwan because it's more favorable in employer. Where in a first contract in the Philippines, they said that majority of the fees is free, including the food and accommodations, other fees, medical, and also there are dormitory fees. But in a second contract, which exists here in Taiwan, it's less favorable for the worker. So it leads to exploitations and unfair working conditions for the workers. Contract deceptions is a common issue, where the conditions promised to the workers before they arrive in Taiwan is not honored to them. So it's very highlight issue for all the workers, even the returning ticket going back to the Philippines when they finish their contract. In the first contract, we state that it's shouldered by the employer, but in the second contract, we said that it must be paid by the workers. So the other issue, this is the monthly broker's fee, which is a burden for all the migrant workers here in Taiwan, not only for the Philippine corridor, but all the other migrant workers, including Vietnam, Vietnamese, Indonesians, and Thailanders. So in this fees, the workers need to pay a broker's fees for their first contract at $1,802. And for the second contract, they must pay 1,700 NT. And the last contract, the last year is 1,500 NT dollars. But the questions of all migrant workers here is, where is the service? Because if there's a service or not, they're pushed to pay the monthly broker's fee, which is a burden from them. It's like a placement fee. Some companies said that they have a fee policy, but in reality, they need to pay. So I think that's one of the major issue or problems of the migrant workers. Now, so they will say that in terms of problems, where these migrant workers goes, recently they said that there's a union or other NGOs, but in participations or contacting of these group organizations, especially the unions, the majority of the workers, especially the Filipinos, are afraid for the retaliations. Because we have an experience in the Philippines that if you are a member of a union, it's very difficult for you to find a new work because they will say that you are against the employer, against of some regulations. So that mentality brings here in Taiwan of some or majority of the Filipino. That's why they are not willing to cooperate or join or ask their complaint to them because they are fear. That's number one. They are fear for the retaliations of the employer. Because when the end of contract, they will choose if they will change their employer or stay in the company. And the worst one is return back to the Philippines. So what's the workers do? Especially if the workers experience problem in the company, so the company will retaliate that if you go to other company, you will not be hired. So because they will give bad mouthing about you. So what is the decisions of the worker? There's only two: to stay to this unhealthy working environment or going back to the Philippines. So this, I think this issue is more problems of the migrant workers here in town, especially for the Filipinos. And I hope that there will be a lot of changes, really changes, I mean, that will be favorable for all the migrant workers. Because these challenges highlights and needs stronger legal protections and enforcement mechanism for the ensure of fair treatment and better working conditions for the migrant workers here in Taiwan, not only for the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for those initial reflections. So I'm hearing, three kind of major issues coming out there that are equally reflected in the findings: the double contracts, the monthly broker fees, and the retaliation or the fear of raising grievances. Charles, I'll turn to you for initial reactions.
Yes, thank you again for inviting me. And I think my initial reaction is that I'm happy that there was a deep dive in Taiwan, especially from the private sector perspective, because from my vantage, being with this migrant shelter and really connecting with migrant workers, a lot of the assistance to migrant workers on these issues, which are systemic, like the curfews, which are allowed by Taiwan law, the fees, which are allowed by Taiwan law, any type of change in that is because of private sector buyers that are influencing their suppliers. There's no other way around it because it's not coming from local legislation. And I don't think internally the Taiwanese companies are willingly going to cover employer pay principle without being nudged by somebody. But I think that's the biggest highlight that I see, that it really shows and gives credit to, I think, a small handful of companies that are really dedicated and passionate about making a difference. which has affected a tremendous amount of Taiwanese companies and really to the workers themselves. Some input, I guess some ideas about the report. For like grievance mechanism, I think is a good topic, because from my vantage is that when workers do use a grievance mechanism, they reach out to our church, they reach out to me personally, a lot what you get is emotions about this is what's happening. I feel hopeless, I'm tired, I just want to go home. But they won't tell you that I have a curfew. That's why I feel hopeless. They won't tell you I have this debt. And that's the reason why. That's why they feel that they want to go home, because they have no choice. And so a lot of it for the grievance mechanism is to be aware that workers don't come up saying, I have forced labor indicators. I have all these problems that would be violations of supplier code of conduct. They're going to say their emotions first. And I think for the grievance mechanism, brands and companies need to consider that a worker is not going to give a clear thought about what's happening, and it takes time to dialogue. And sometimes with my engagement of trying to connect workers to buyers, sometimes they don't realize the worker's real concern because of this. So I think that's something to consider for private sector companies. Another issue is about remedy too, because what I've been seeing now, you see that a lot of the service fees, for example, are being removed, but there was a progression in that. I know when we first talked about the report, you said our service fees are paid in the payslip, and I remember I said to you 5 years ago it was in the payslip, but now it's deducted directly from their bank book. And it was only this year actually I found out there's a new way, is that they actually make the workers transfer money to the agencies to pay for service fees. So there's no record in the bank book that it's being deducted, but the workers pay in cash to a 7-Eleven, which is a new strategy. So it's evolving of how you kind of deceive the policies coming from buyers. And another issue about the remedy is also the use of subsidiaries in Taiwan. So a lot of the tier 1 suppliers are really following these policies, but their subsidiaries, which are then also making products for the parent company, are kind of the loophole to avoid any kind of audits or investigations to the working conditions in the subsidiaries. So a lot of the times the workers will come to us saying, I'm making product for such and such, but in the system, it's not our company, but it's the parent company that we're putting on the labels, we're putting on the tags. So that's another issue that's happening in Taiwan that should be made aware of as well. And I think that's good for my part. And the other issues like the dormitory policy, but we could probably talk about that a bit later as well.
Thank you so much, Charles. So much to unpack there. Monique, I'm going to hand over to you for initial reflections on the findings, and if you wanted to respond to anything that Charles mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks also for having me for this webinar. Maybe, yeah, just a couple of points from initial reactions. From my view, one is the overall scoring. I think that was a little bit surprising. So, of course, Samsung is very positively surprised and happy to see, of course, that we're for this year leading the ranking in the ICT sector. But we're also very much aware that this ranking is a relative assessment. So if we look at the absolute numbers, it's still only a 61 out of 100. So there's still, of course, a way to go. I think the other thing is allegations, a response to allegations. You know, at KnowTheChain, we had some deep dive conversations around that topic, where it can be sometimes also a little bit tricky for companies. I think we come later also a little bit to the point of disclosure itself, but maybe also just to make the point that sometimes it's a little bit black and white for companies who sometimes find themselves in reports or in media articles. Then we do, of course, a deep dive in an investigation. And if we find this not to be proven, it's out there forever and it will be referenced for a very long time. So to disprove sometimes then is very difficult for a company, and it basically follows you. And I think this is perhaps also sometimes where benchmarks have a little bit of a limitation, where there are certain questions that pertain to one allegation, but sometimes the civil society recommendation can be, for example, different. And I'm just picking here one of the more extreme examples that would be, you know, an NGO report, for example, on Uyghur in China, for example, where, you know, the only engagement with rights holders is essentially disengagement, because in that type of environment of systematic and systemic forced labor, there is no credible way of doing it differently. And then the third one would be access to remedy. And I really agree here also on the voices that we have heard. Specifically also, I think it is our experience that is very important for workers to even be aware of their rights in order to articulate it, because if you don't know, it's very hard for you to even put that into words, and therefore it makes a lot of sense that this is rather coming from a place of emotions rather than a complaint in terms of their rights and the violations. And so, well, seeing the rather low score here, I think is relatively concerning, because ultimately it really then means also that the risk combined with the lack of access to remedy does not only accelerate really the saliency of the problem, but also the potential harm, of course, to victims. So I think it's very important to build that trust, which is also our experience, really, even if you have it in place, to remove the barriers. And we are trying to do this also now more with the standalone grievance resolution policy that we released. So we currently do a lot of effort internally, but the next step is then also really to cascade that down to our business partners and our value chain, where there is an enhanced gender lens, but also more focus on the effectiveness criteria of the UNGPs. And maybe I leave it for that for now.
Thanks so much, Monique, for those reflections. And yes, we will get into a discussion around policy and practice and disclosure and practice, and how we kind of balance those two requirements a bit later in the discussion. Luda, from an investment perspective, when you look at the report and the findings, is there anything that jumps out at you in particular? And then if you wanted to respond to any of the other panelists and what they've already mentioned.
Yeah, so over the past couple of years, we've been looking into access to remedy and remedy readiness of companies we invest in, including in the ICT sector. And we definitely see it as a weak spot for a lot of companies. And it was quite interesting to see this reflected in the ratings as well. Sometimes we find it very difficult to assess whether companies' grievance mechanisms are accessible to workers. And of course, when we're speaking about migrant workers, workers in factories that are much further away from the headquarters, where the companies don't necessarily have day-to-day access to those communication channels with the workers on the ground, it can be quite challenging for us on the one hand to say how effective those processes are in terms of delivering the messages from the ground up. But we also appreciate the challenges for the companies in putting them in place and assessing their effectiveness. So we've been trying to increase our engagement around the topics of remedy and grievance mechanisms, and also with remedy, we often find that companies focus a lot on kind of the financial aspects of remediation. Whereas if, for example, companies were a bit more proactive in instituting some of those communication channels that you have highlighted in the report, so something that, for example, Rosie has spoken about in terms of freedom of association, for instance, having alternative means of remediation would have been more feasible. And for example, we see very few companies talk about mediation. We have been engaging with a lot of the companies on the list, and I'd say we probably agree with the ranking. I was happy to see some companies, especially those based in Asia, progress. And what we found very often in our dialogue with some of the companies lower down the list, apologies, is sometimes they will have the right processes and the mindset in place, but the disclosures are not quite there. So it's a bit of a black box for us. So I think that the ranking makes a really strong case for kind of clear disclosure that meets investor and stakeholder expectations as well. And we've been using it as a framework to share with companies. So yeah, happy to continue this discussion.
Thank you so much, Luda. That was incredibly helpful. I think because we've been touching on it, and Monique and Luda, you've also touched on it in your comments. I guess the challenge around disclosure versus practice, or disclosure and transparency around the implementation of policies. And while we see kind of particularly through this research in Taiwan and and the analysis that's been conducted there, a growing gap between those two, we also appreciate that there's a lot of moving parts to this, and internal conflicts within companies themselves in terms of kind of how much to disclose and what to disclose. Monique, to your point around kind of some more kind of legal risks there. Something that we did highlight with Samsung in particular this year is this kind of moving towards disclosure of those kind of metrics in terms of implementations, and then the evidence that of how policies are being implemented and the outcomes for workers. And Monique, I wonder if you could just take us through briefly the evolution of that process internally at Samsung, and yeah, some of the conversations that I guess you've had to have internally in relation to transparency.
Yes, thank you very much. So maybe first of all, also a little bit to the challenges of even identifying. I mean, that's of course not rocket science. We all know, we have very opaque supply chains, but it's also around really the nuances of forced labor, because I think sometimes there's also this notion to only focus on the very severe cases and focus more on remediation than prevention. But it's really also about the ILO indicators of forced labor and the environment that creates the forced labor risks that are oftentimes not fully understood. And even after a lot of capacity building, we see that some business partners do not fully understand the nuances in this regard. Then I think here, in terms of the challenges when it comes to the reporting instances, of course, we have seen this one slide where there's an increase in Asian company disclosure, and then of course the question is, does it reflect improvement in practices or improved transparency? And we do have, of course, quite a bit of a push when it comes to the transparency disclosure side recently, especially also in Europe. Some legislations, and that is a challenge, certainly, unfortunately, do have side effects, especially for compliance and legal departments, who are then definitely more cautious when it comes to the disclosure. And we see this particularly in the US with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So I think that's something we should prevent in duplicating in terms of unintended consequences in the US with the EU forced labor ban, but also with the CSDDD. And then, ultimately, it's about really focusing on the UNGPs and on the OECD guidelines without really getting that tunnel vision, also with all the chaos that is going on with the omnibus law, to not get distracted and really keep on track on what we have committed ourselves to, which is the international human rights standards. And so we have certainly increased the level here of reporting from the risks to actual infringements, what we have identified in audits, the elements that we have identified, what we have been doing in terms of preventing, but also in remedy. And here, specifically, the issue was also not so much even, I would say, in the value chain and in the supply chain, but also disclosure in our own operations, because we're vertically integrated, and it's perceived as a higher risk to disclose that, some indicators are still sometimes, popping up in terms of risk also in our own operations. And I think it was also a learning curve internally, especially to convince the top management here that disclosure of negative things can be a good thing, because you can show that you are proactive, because ultimately it remains that if you're not finding these things, probably you're not looking hard enough, because we all know it exists, unfortunately. So really finding also internally the benefit of sort of the negative in identifying. And so then a little bit maybe from policy to practice, of course, you know, a lot of companies, and including us, we have commitments and policies in place, and that is very important for not only internally, but also business partners and for our stakeholders to path the way in the direction we want to go. But we all also know the real work really starts, and the tricky part when we want to implement that commitment. And there very quickly we will face obstacles in wanting to drive that change in really good faith. Weak governance, weak rule of law, lacking leverage, cascading down to business partners, making those policies fully understood, the nuances that I was referring to, monitoring the implementation, geopolitics, and really other factors. So we are doing a lot, and I will not get into the details that, of course, everyone can read up. We have specifically also more on child labor and forced labor, really dedicated in the last few years, much more effort also in the lower tiers, where we, for example, also do now second tier audits. We have created additional tools, specifically also forced labor, in addition to other elements, to really focus more on the prevention part. Of course, access to remedy, grievance mechanisms, all of this remains extremely critical, but really also the prevention piece. And then when it comes to the drivers, of course, we understand we will be held accountable by different stakeholders once we have made that public commitment. But of course, there's also then, you know, the external push from CSDD, CSRD, and, you know, existing legislations. But also we do see a heavy increase of customer requests, I can say. And then there are, of course, also investors, and last but not least, also benchmarks that give us a push.
Thank you so much, Monique. I wanted to turn back to kind of a more local context, and maybe get Michael, your reflections, and Charles about, you know, what do you feel needs to kind of change or improve when we look at corporate accountability in particular? And Charles, you mentioned that there is a huge opportunity here, particularly in the case of, or in the context of Taiwan, for companies to have a real positive impact. What do you think would be the few initiatives or, you know, practices that companies can do to tangibly improve conditions for workers on the ground? Michael, I'll turn to you first, and then Charles.
Hello.
Yes, can you hear you?
So I think that for better changes is by eliminating this called double contracts. It must be one contract exceed only from the country of origin to the country of destinations. So in this, we can ensure that the worker can sign the same contract from the home country as the same contract that is signed and enforced here in Taiwan. So I think we can achieve this through legal reforms. So some implementations about regulations, and they need to mandate the enforcement of the which is the original contract terms. And also transparency. I think it requires employers to provide clear and translated copies of contracts to the workers before the departure and upon arrival here in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Charles, anything to add there?
Yes, I think, well, like some of the gaps right now, like I mentioned before, the fees are doing well in terms of the brands addressing fees and the private sector addressing the fees. But in Taiwan, one of the gaps, if like Michael said, is the double contract. So I think right now most of the policies are just the contract is in the local language, but it doesn't really explicitly mention multiple contracts or differing contracts. Number two would be the dormitory situation too, where there's a gap, because what happened in Taiwan locally is that now that you have these no fee employer pay principle enacted, the agencies are trying to figure out where can they make their buck. And it's become the dormitory management. And right now, I don't think there's any brand that has, none of the electronics brand has like a dormitory policy or living condition policy, aside from restriction of movement into the living areas. but nothing explicitly about how it should be run and managed. So one of the issues right now we're seeing is that workers' dormitories are 45 minutes plus away from their factory. And these aren't being picked up in the audits, and no company has policies yet. And I don't think there's any investor initiatives kind of focused on dormitory conditions. So locally in Taiwan, that would be a good start, because that's where a lot of the fees now are being taken out of the workers, is that you have an electricity bill that it can't be explained how it gets charged so high, but that's subsidizing the placement fee and the service fees. So that's something moving forward. Hopefully the dormitories as well as the double contracts can be addressed.
And Charles, you think that there's an opportunity for brands to really demonstrate leadership in this regard, in the absence of policy, which is extremely important to note for any brands on the call today. Luda, I know we're running close to time and want to leave some time for questions at the end. Just from an investment perspective, again, and you alluded to it previously about how you would like to use the findings or how you think they could be useful. Could you provide a bit of insight into how you might use the findings going forward, and how useful you think they are to your work?
Oh no, the findings are incredibly useful because very often it's difficult for us to find detailed information on high-risk sectors and companies' behavior. So we, as investors, we get information from our own research, data providers. We don't rely on ESG scores, but we pull, for example, raw data on practices and policies that companies have in place around human rights issues. But KnowTheChain definitely offers some of the richest set of data points for the assessment of companies' human rights risks management in supply chains. So what we have been using the KnowTheChain data for is guiding our kind of priorities for companies, identifying areas of weakness and areas for improvement, providing peer examples to companies, for example, pointing them to the ratings, the sheets for stronger performers, and also mapping our risks and identifying kind of companies to prioritize for engagement. So lots of potential use cases. It's incredibly helpful that KnowTheChain provides specific areas for improvement with very concrete steps that companies can take, and we've really appreciated it because we're able to kind of share it with companies.
Thank you for those reflections, Luda. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, so I will hand over to Kane, who's going to moderate the Q&A portion, and yes, hopefully the panelists can answer any questions that we have. So.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the amazing contributions as well. It's been really brilliant to hear such expert insight on these important issues. We have 3 questions, so I think I will start with the first one and direct it to Monique. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who wants to know, how would you talk to an ICT business about business and human rights and responsible recruitment during this uncertain time of tariff crisis?
Yeah, very, very good question. Actually, one of the pieces of the intervention that I wanted to make is that our job becomes much more difficult now, because it's not only that, we also have, for example, the reversal of the donations that will certainly lead to some type of impact when it comes to child and forced labor. We have seen the same basically occurring during COVID times. And then you add, you know, poverty, geopolitics, protectionism, climate migration, all these issues on top of it, so it becomes more difficult. I don't have a full answer to that. I can only say that probably, you know, some adaptations will be needed, but we remain on our path. As I said earlier, I think in times of distraction and increased difficulty, it's really about going back to the basics, which is for us international human rights standards. We look back to the UNGPs, what we have committed ourselves to, and we try to really keep on track here. But certainly those, let's call them distractions, or just, you know, really, I mean, real life complications that will lead to consequences are definitely not making our job easier.
Thanks for that. Would anyone like to come in on that point and add anything? No? Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question then. This can go to either Anya or Rosie, as it's a question to KnowTheChain. Someone has asked, do you have any suggestions on engaging with unions? And does KnowTheChain have any future plans for further work in Taiwan based on our research findings?
I mean, I can just come in on the first part of that initially. I think, yeah, we have limited examples to go off in this sector, but there are a lot more practices, I think, that might be useful for companies to learn from in other sectors that we assess, like the apparel and footwear sector, where you have a lot more kind of binding agreements in place, global framework agreements with local and global unions that provide a framework within which companies and unions can work together. So I think, yeah, we can certainly share some examples from this. I don't know actually if any other panelists also have recommendations on that side of how companies can work better with unions in their supply chains, but yeah, and then Anya, perhaps I'll do it to you.
Yeah. So in terms of Taiwan, this has been kind of the first attempt, as I mentioned, to look at a very strategic sourcing location in one of our sector benchmarks. Taiwan represents a hugely important context for electronic sourcing and manufacturing, and I don't think, even despite, you know, tariffs and geopolitical tensions, that's going to change. And so we will aim to continue to familiarize ourselves with the context and provide support, I think, to organizations that are working on these issues on the ground, and particularly from our position as being an intermediary between, you know, companies and civil society organizations. I think we can use our leverage in that situation to hold companies to account. Yes, so that's what I would say. We do have upcoming in the next couple of weeks, in line with the launch of the ICT Benchmark, capacity building workshop for civil society organizations in Taiwan planned, which will be led by our colleague in Hong Kong. So please do get in touch with us for more details on that. But suffice to say, yes, the ambition is that this would just be the start of increased work in this context.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're close to time, but we have two more questions, so we'll see if we can get through them. One question is directed to Rosie, but I think if anyone would like to come in on this, it would be really good to hear as many opinions as possible. Someone has asked, what positive changes do you foresee or anticipate from the companies that have been considered in the study presented by Rosie? Considering that they have already committed, have corporate commitments to respecting human rights, but seem to honor them only in breach, is this going to be business as usual? Would anyone like to come in? Luda, please go ahead.
This might be a very small sample, but we have seen companies who have been presented with the results of the KnowTheChain assessment take action. And in fact, some companies have told us, we're thank you for pointing us towards this other framework, but we're currently working on the KnowTheChain results and getting better. So even if it's a sort of a carrot and stick approach, and it's already helpful, but I think it's led to a lot of very in-depth dialogues, at least for us, and especially for companies lower down the chain and companies at least striving to put in place more processes, and at the very least starting with kind of the basics of policies and human rights kind of process setup. So I have some hope.
Monique, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I can only speak for Samsung side, of course. So what we usually do is we utilize the findings and perform a gap analysis of all the indicators and sub-indicators. And then we basically develop an action plan on how we can further close some of the existing gaps. That may not be 100%. That is, of course, a journey and takes a lot of time, specifically now with us having the task of doing this on value chain scope. But what we usually do is we review not only our benchmark and see the recommendations for us, but we really also take a deep dive into, the good practices in the industry from our peers, but also in other industries. And then we look how we can take this on board. And this is basically a practice we do for all benchmarks.
Kane, could I just jump in here as well? I mean, I think, I think what we have identified in the report is, systemic kind of gaps in a number of areas that could drive the instance of forced labor from a corporate perspective, and that is kind of overlaid on contextual issues that we've spoken about. So these combined factors of kind of the lack of identified support for freedom of association and worker organizing and purchasing practices that seem to really be driving fragmentation and fragility in sector supply chains, and also increases the risk of forced labor, is something that I think a collaborative approach that the sector needs to consider. Across the sector as a whole, and with a collaborative effort. So yes, I mean, again, we identify these gaps and make recommendations, and it really is up to companies and investors and anyone with leverage and responsibility for human rights impacts to be looking at this individually and collectively to address them.
Okay, I think we're at time and I don't want to detain people any further. Also, Anya, I feel like you will give a quite rousing close to the proceedings, so I think I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Kane. Thanks for the moderation and just some kind of final thoughts from me, and thank yous to all of our panelists for joining. As I mentioned, the report is designed to really outline gaps and areas of improvement, but also where companies are doing better. And we have seen that through the findings. Baseline human rights due diligence processes have improved, but the level of maturity in the sector is still quite nascent in turning those policies into practice. And so just to end, we encourage you all to read the report and to kind of pore over the recommendations, and also to feed back to us on how useful the findings have been to you in your own advocacy and your own, you know, day-to-day work. Thank you so much once again for joining us, and for those who couldn't make it, the session has been recorded. We look forward to seeing you at the next launch of the Agri-Food benchmark later on in this year. And yeah, we appreciate your attention to the KnowTheChain benchmark. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.